Hello, it's Silver. This is Hyperviolent. So Hyperviolent is a shooter, as you may expect from the name, but it's not your average sort of boomer shooter kind of experience. This is actually inspired heavily by games like System Shock, which is unexpected because very few games take inspiration from System Shock nowadays. Well, a lot of survival horror games are of course based in ideas that System Shock helped to create, but what I mean is a game that actually plays like that, and you don't really see that very often. So this is not a fast-paced shooter. This is a much slower-paced game, very survival horror, and has a really good sense of atmosphere. It's actually kind of impressive, the engine that they made this game in, and how they managed to create this very oppressive, creepy sci-fi atmosphere. The first thing you'll notice that's a bit odd is the controls. The controls are kind of strange because left click is your left hand and right click is your right hand, which is kind of, it makes sense to say it out loud, but is sort of the opposite of how it usually works in games like this, where left click is generally your main hand. So the controls do take a little bit of getting used to, but it's not that bad to actually figure it out. And the game does have a grid-based inventory management system, so you are encouraged in very classic survival horror fashion to only take what you need, and of course all of your ammo and stuff does take up a room, so you gotta be careful about how much you're carrying, and this often means that you don't really have that much ammo for most of your weapons, so a lot of what you're doing is going to be melee combat in this game in order to actually conserve on that ammo until you reach some of the later areas where enemies are actually ranged, at which point you will actually need to be facing them with ranged weapons because trying to get up close to them is just going to kill you most of the time. The next thing to talk about is, of course, the atmosphere itself and the visuals. So it's got a pretty unique visual style when it comes to this combination of like sprite work and 3D modeling for the environments. It's unique in the sense that it's very System Shock inspired, and like I said, not very many games actually go for that inspiration. So when you compare it to other shooters with a similar art style, it still manages to stand out and look relatively unique because of its oppressive, grimy sci-fi atmosphere, and its relatively horrifying enemy sprites and very gory deaths for the sprites and things that look just very disturbing, and is obviously part of the point because that's one thing that System Shock was known for. It's very disturbing and unsettling enemies, and the various creepy noises they made, and the fact that some of them actually like told you that they were sorry as they were attacking you and stuff like that. That just made the atmosphere feel really creepy and weird, and this game is definitely going for a similar vibe. Map design is definitely the next thing to talk about. This is very important for any retro-inspired shooter, really, because a lot of the shooters that they were inspired by were known for having really good map design, but this is especially important for something inspired by games like System Shock because the level design of those games was a little bit Metroidvania-ish, but not too directly like that, and it also had a lot of, well, a fair amount of backtracking and things, but they were generally signposted well enough to where you didn't get lost all that easily. You're talking about sometimes some relatively labyrinthine levels that were still pretty easy to navigate once you got used to how they worked. You know, there were some wings of the ship in System Shock that were very maze-like, but once you were there for a little while, you could kind of get used to how you navigated them, and they became not that intimidating once you got used to them. This game is obviously going for something that feels kind of similar to that, so you have pretty sprawling levels that are large, but also usually well signposted with enemy spawns and lighting and stuff to help you understand where you need to go. However, one thing that a lot of people are going to have a problem with in this game is the amount of backtracking that you have to do. I don't personally mind it because I'm used to this sort of thing, but I also know that not everyone is a fan of that, and this game does do a lot of backtracking. Pretty much every level, in fact, you're going to have to backtrack a fair amount because most of the time you're going to find color-coded doors, and you actually need to find the color-coded keycards to go to those doors, which is a very familiar thing for a shooter like this, but a lot of those doors are pretty early in the levels, and you find the keys much later on after quite a lot of exploration, which means you're going to have to backtrack through most of the level to go back and remember where the door is. This is compounded by the fact that the game does not currently have a map. So you really need to get used to the environment, not only because of the nice atmosphere that it gives off, but you gotta remember where your various guideposts are and sort of make some mental landmarks as you're exploring because you don't have a map to refer to, so you gotta remember how to actually navigate back to these doors and some other places that you can explore later. This is definitely going to be a pretty major splitting point for people, I feel. You know, some people are gonna really like the somewhat labyrinthine level design and how deep you can get into them and how long you can actually go around each one because there's a lot to find and see, but other people are going to be completely turned off by this and feel that it's too labyrinthine, it's too heavy on backtracking, and it's very easy to get lost, and without a map it's hard to actually get back on track sometimes. I'm kind of in the middle, personally. I am used to backtracking in games like this, so that part doesn't really bother me. The part that kind of gets me is sometimes this game does have old school shooter syndrome of, I push a button, what did it do? You know, that thing that happens in some old school shooters where you throw a switch or you push a button and something happens somewhere and you don't really know what or where, so you just have to look through the level and find it. The game does do that sometimes, and I'm not a huge fan of that. Most of the time, though, the backtracking you're doing is to find those doors that you just got access cards for, which is not as bad because those are a lot more easily signposted and found because they glow brightly in the color of the key card. But yeah, there's still going to be a good number of people that are turned off by the level design in this game, I feel. So I figured I'd mention it because your mileage may vary. You could be like me and be used to this sort of thing, or you could absolutely bounce off of it super hard. Combat is actually pretty solid. The guns have a good amount of feedback, and this is helped by the fact that you don't use them all that often. You're not constantly shooting everything you see because you don't have the ammo for that. So it feels a little bit more satisfying to use a ranged weapon because they're not something that you get to use all the time. There's a fair number of melee weapons that you can find, and these are relatively satisfying to use. Not quite as satisfying as the guns, but they're not too bad. They're about as good as you can get for a relatively graphically simplistic game like this as far as melee combat feedback goes. But the ranged weapons have a pretty cool bit of animation to them, some nice lighting, and some good sound effects and things that make them, they fit, right? They fit within the universe. A lot of the ranged weapons feel like they could kind of break at any moment. They don't, but they sort of feel like you're just barely holding everything together, which is sort of the feel that any survival horror game like this is generally going to go for. You know, you're supposed to feel like you're just barely holding on. Like every shot is a large expenditure of resources that you can't afford to miss, that kind of feeling, and it does manage to capture that pretty well. Also interesting to note is that some weapons are two-handed, and this means you can't hold both a melee weapon and a ranged weapon at the same time with those, which is a useful thing to be able to do. That way you have a weapon ready for different threats that you can come across without having to go to your inventory, because going to your inventory does not pause the game. So if you have to switch to a ranged weapon in the middle of combat, you have to do it as quick as possible because the enemies will still be coming after you while you're doing it. But the various two-handed weapons like the shotgun, for instance, have really cool sprite work that looks awesome and really nice, satisfying sound feedback and things to them, so they're really fun to use, but as you would expect, ammunition for something like that is relatively scarce, so you're not going to be blasting everything with a shotgun at like level 2 or anything like that. You're going to have to scrounge for ammo for a while before you can reliably use it on a regular basis to deal with threats. Most of the time you're going to be resorting to melee smacks to the head and backing up and ducking in and out of combat like that classic survival horror melee dance that you expect in a game like this. But regardless of how you feel about the level design, one thing you can't say is that the game gets samey, because it actually mixes it up quite often. You are in a sci-fi facility, so you are going to see a lot of similar environments, but the environments do change a fair amount, from like more overgrown sort of a hydroponic-y areas to some other stuff like that, and of course your classic creepy med bays filled with horrible experiments and mistreatment and malpractice, all that lovely stuff. But the game also introduces some vehicle sections which are unexpected, and they control and feel atmospherically kind of like the Descent games a little bit. I definitely wasn't expecting these, but I think it's a cool addition, and it is also something that speaks well for what else they may have in store later on in the early access campaign. If the levels are going to be this varied right now in terms of what you can actually do in them, it speaks nicely to the other ideas that they may have in store once you get to later areas that aren't currently available yet. So while I'm definitely a big fan of the atmosphere and I like the overall sort of exploration and survival horror combat feel of the game, I do have a couple of problems with it. One is the thing I mentioned earlier, that the level design is going to turn a lot of people off and is very much dependent on how much tolerance you have for backtracking and stuff. But the other thing I haven't really mentioned yet is the combat can feel sort of odd sometimes. It's not that the feedback isn't okay, because it's serviceable, it's fine, but enemies can be extremely spongy in this game and take a lot of damage, and that's kind of a problem in a survival horror game where everything is a measure of how many resources can I scrounge up and save, and having to, expend like a dozen bullets on every single enemy can get kind of annoying sometimes, and it makes the ranged combat feel weaker than it should when it takes so many shots to kill even basic enemies a lot of the times. I feel that the enemies are maybe a bit too spongy. I understand what they're going for. They're going for that implaceable sort of undead creepiness that makes the enemies hard to put down, and I get that from like an atmosphere standpoint, but from a gameplay standpoint, it is a little bit obnoxious to have to fire so much at even basic, like normal tier enemies just to take them down sometimes. But the other big issue with the combat, and perhaps the biggest issue with the game as a whole right now, is the AI. The enemy AI is extremely simplistic to the point that it's actually detrimental to the game. Enemies basically just make a beeline for you. As soon as they see you, they will run in a straight direction towards you. If there's something in their way, they won't attempt to go around it, they'll just sort of run in place. And this means that you can often find enemies stuck around doors because they tried to get to you through the door, and they just sort of get stuck to the wall next to the door. And so you take a bunch of like unavoidable damage as soon as you pass through the door, because some enemies are hit scan for some reason, and as soon as you pass into their line of sight, they'll just automatically target you and hit you in a way you could never have prevented. And taking unavoidable damage is never a good feeling in a survival horror game. This even extends to the extremely tough enemies and the bosses, which are generally just slow lumbering things that walk completely straight towards you and hit scan you from far away, and that's pretty much all they do. And I think in order to give a better sense of atmosphere and a better sense of exploration, the enemy AI needs to be severely upgraded in this game. It's too simplistic right now. The fact that everything just beelines straight towards you with no nuance at all as soon as it sees you, or even detects you, like you just have to enter into a wing of the ship and everything knows you're there and just starts walking in a straight line towards you. It definitely needs to be fixed up a little bit. I think that is definitely going to be the biggest sticking point for people, is the fact that the AI is just too simplistic, and of all the things that the game does quite well and the things that the game is good at, its AI is definitely holding the rest of it back. But having said that, it is still a rare example of a System Shock-inspired game that it has a really cool sense of exploration and atmosphere, so it's hard for me not to say at least keep an eye on it, because even though it is somewhat hard to recommend unless you are aware of the caveats right now of kind of crappy AI and a lot of backtracking, if you're okay with those things, then it is actually a fun time investment to get into, because the sense of atmosphere is great. But otherwise, you may want to look out for some patches. Luckily, there is a major patch on the way at the time I'm recording this that is poised to maybe fix some of this. So they are clearly aware of some of the shortcomings right now, and it is nice to see that there are some pretty significant patches on the way already to start addressing this sort of stuff. So definitely one to keep an eye on. It's a rare example for sure. So thank you guys very much for watching. I will put a link in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can go and check it out on your own time, and I'll see you guys next time.